and welcome to American Catholic History, brought to you by the support of listeners like you. If you value this content, please become a supporter at americancatholichistory.org/support. I'm Noelle Heaster-Crow.
And I'm Tom Crow.
We start today with a word of thanks to those who've signed on as supporters recently, especially David W., Jeff Q., Adam M., and Caroline E. Your support really encourages us to keep this going.
Also, thank you to those who have given us 5-star ratings and comments. We made it up to number 122 among all history podcasts on Apple, which is actually pretty exciting for us. I mean, there are tons of history podcasts out there.
I know. I was excited.
Yeah. And getting that high only happens when people boost us with ratings and shares and comments. So thank you to all who have done those things. And please keep it up.
One final note before we get to the topic of the day. We're setting up our pilgrimages schedule for the summer of 2025. Right now, we're looking at returning to the Kentucky Holy Land and Bourbon Country in June, one of our favorite pilgrimages.
It's awesome.
And then going up to Wisconsin in August. That'll be a new itinerary. If you'd like to get the details as soon as they're available, sign up for pilgrimages updates at americancatholichistory.org/pilgrimages.
Yeah, and I can't wait for both of those pilgrimages. So, all that said, let's get to why we are really here today.
Today, we're talking about Eucharistic congresses here in the United States, national and international.
Yes, the National Eucharistic Congress taking place this week in Indianapolis is the 10th National Eucharistic Congress. But when you add in 2 international congresses that have also taken place in the United States, we have had 12 such gatherings, and we're going to talk about a little bit, or at least mention all of them.
We actually had an opportunity to take part, at least a little, in this Congress.
Right. I mean, we couldn't go to Indianapolis. It was just too expensive. But we were able to take part in one of the Eucharistic pilgrimages as it made its way to Indianapolis.
Right. For this Congress, the organizers had 4 pilgrimage processions carrying the Blessed Sacrament, and they set out from 4 different points in the United States. The 4 routes converged this week in Indianapolis. One of the routes, the one named in honor of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, began in New Haven, Connecticut. It made its way through New York, New Jersey, down to Philly, then Baltimore and Washington, D.C., before swinging through Emmitsburg, Maryland, where Mother Seton really did her thing. Then across Pennsylvania to Pittsburgh, before crossing the Ohio River, right here into Steubenville.
Yeah, and here in our town, our Hilltop Montessori School was invited to participate in the local procession that went from the public amphitheater on the banks of the river through downtown and ending at our parish, St. Peter. It was a really incredible experience.
And I can only imagine how many thousands of people across the country had similar experiences.
Yeah, and hopefully these processions in the Congress in Indianapolis have a tremendous impact on the faith and spiritual health of our country.
Now, in this episode, we're not going to even attempt to give a blow-by-blow account of what happened at each of the congresses. We'd be here forever. So this is really more of a survey. What we want to do is share a bit about what a Eucharistic Congress is, what gave rise to this movement, and what these congresses are intended to accomplish. And we'll talk a bit about highlights from a number of the national and international congresses which have taken place here in the United States. So for starters, Congress. Why is it called a Congress?
Right. So here in the United States, the word Congress typically means the 2 bodies that make up the legislative branch of our federal government, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And actually, it also reminds me of a joke. If pro is the opposite of con, then what is the opposite of progress? Congress. Anyhow, the meaning of the word Congress, well, it comes from the Latin congressus, which means meeting, assembly, or gathering. In late Middle English, it came to denote meetings of adversaries at which they would negotiate or work things out.
But at root, it's about a meeting of leaders, representatives, or otherwise people with an interest in the topic to be discussed. The origins of Eucharistic congresses go back to the 19th century France.
In truth, the roots go back even further to the French Revolution and everything that happened in the 6 or 7 decades which followed it.
Another American Catholic history topic that goes back to the French Revolution.
Yeah, it was a major, major event in the history of the church.
Yeah, as you keep saying, the gift that keeps on giving.
I know.
To the American church, anyways.
Right, yeah, like the Avignon Papacy, the Great Western Schism, and the fall of Constantinople, its ramifications will ripple through the centuries. But in this particular case, the ripples just sort of bounced around within the church in France for the first 6 or 7 decades.
Yes, through the 19th century, many faithful French Catholics, women in particular, worked to restore much that had been lost during the French Revolution and then the Napoleonic years. Many of the church's great treasures had been looted, destroyed, or packed up and shipped elsewhere for safekeeping. Women formed societies to produce new vestments and other items for worship. They recognized that the most potent way to restore the Catholic spirit of France was to restore reverent and attractive liturgy.
Just so. Lex orandi, lex credendi, lex vivendi. As you pray, so will you believe, and so will you live.
Right. Now, essential to their prayer life was a devotion to the Blessed Sacrament, and this also makes sense. The Blessed Sacrament is the center of worship, so any movement which seeks to restore the Catholic character of a culture must have devotion to the real presence of Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament at its core. 2
figures in particular come to the fore in this work in France, Peter Julien Aymard and Marie Martha Thomissier. Aymard founded the Congregation of the Blessed Sacrament for male religious and the Servants of the Blessed Sacrament for women. Later, he established the Priests' Eucharistic League, which was intended for secular diocesan priests. These orders and the League emphasized a particular devotion to the Blessed Sacrament. Father Aymard organized public exposition of the Blessed Sacrament in Paris, and the Priests' League spread, reaching the United States by the end of the 19th century.
Mademoiselle Thomissier became something of an acolyte of Father Aymard's and took inspiration from his devotion to the Blessed Sacrament. She began organizing pilgrimages to places in France where Eucharistic miracles had taken place. These pilgrimages, between 1873 and 1878, gained a lot of attention and had lots of pilgrims.
In 1878, Pope Leo XIII personally approved of her work and encouraged her to go a step further. He encouraged her to organize a Eucharistic Congress, at which those gathered could do more than just offer prayer and worship, but could share ideas about how to further promote devotion to the Blessed Sacrament in the places that they came from. So, in 1881, the first International Eucharistic Congress was held at Lille in France.
The event was so well received by the church hierarchy, particularly Pope Leo XIII, that he made permanent the pontifical commission that he had established to help Thomissier organize that first one. Since then, 52 international congresses have been held, with the 53rd coming up this fall in Quito, Ecuador.
Of those 53, just 2 of them have been in the United States. The 28th was held in Chicago in 1926, and the 41st was in Philadelphia in 1976.
But that first International Eucharistic Congress wasn't the first Eucharistic Congress held in the United States.
Right. The first National Eucharistic Congress had been held 21 years earlier in 1895 in Washington, D.C. Now, this is an interesting point where I found discrepancies online in my research. A number of places where I read about the national congresses in the U.S., they claim that the first one was in 1901. There was a National Eucharistic Congress in 1901, but it was the second, so I'm not sure why some of those places said it was the first.
In 1895, the first National Eucharistic Congress gathered in Washington, D.C. This gathering included 25 bishops and archbishops and about 250 priests, most of whom were members of the Priests' Eucharistic League. Chief among those present was the Archbishop of Baltimore, James Cardinal Gibbons.
The first Congress came at an interesting time in the history of the Church in the U.S. The major waves of German and Irish immigrants had mostly slowed to a trickle, comparatively speaking anyhow. This period saw many more immigrants from Southern, Central, and Eastern Europe. Ellis Island was open and welcoming immigrants by the boatload daily. Italians, Slavs, Greeks, and Eastern Catholics from the Eastern Mediterranean, like the Maronites, were coming and bringing their Eastern Catholicism with them.
This was also the period when Catholicism began to emerge as a cultural and political force in the United States. Still a minority, Catholics were gaining more notice and even respect as leaders of organizations, politicians, journalists, businessmen, etc.
Cardinal Gibbons really had a lot to do with that. He was a statesman par excellence. He was a proud, patriotic American and a devoted churchman. We haven't done an episode on him yet, and really we haven't mentioned him much because we haven't covered the 1890s through the 19-teens that much. But we will. He is a major, major figure in the history of the church in the U.S. Doing him justice in one episode really could be tough. Anyhow, back to the Eucharistic Congresses.
Right. Well, as we said, that first one was in 1895 in Washington, D.C. The second National Eucharistic Congress was in 1901 in St. Louis. Then the third was in New York in 1904, the fourth in Pittsburgh in 1907, and then in Cincinnati in 1911.
That was the final one for a while, possibly because of World War I, which began in 1914. It also was the final National Eucharistic Congress that welcomed only clergy.
But before there was another national congress, the U.S. would host its first International Eucharistic Congress. This was in 1926. The man who brought the international event to the U.S. was the inimitable George Cardinal Mundelein, Archbishop of Chicago.
Cardinal Mundelein. Now there's another figure whose story could easily be more than one episode. Cardinal Mundelein built much of the church in Chicago, and he's responsible for the massive and lovely St. Mary of the Lake Seminary, about 40 miles north of the city of Chicago.
St. Mary of the Lake is more commonly known as Mundelein Seminary in his honor, and the town nearby changed its name to Mundelein during the cardinal's lifetime. That's how big of a figure he was, even in his day.
Well, Cardinal Mundelein convinced the Pope to put the 28th International Eucharistic Congress in the Archdiocese of Chicago. He told Pope Pius XI, "Holy Father, permit the celebration of the next Eucharistic Congress to take place in Chicago, and I promise you 1,000,000 communions as a spiritual bouquet to your august presence."
It worked. I mean, I'd take him up on that too.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
The Pope sent a delegation which included 6 cardinals and 60 bishops. They arrived in New York by boat and took a specially outfitted train with Pullman cars painted red in honor of the cardinals aboard across country to Chicago.
The Chicago Symphony Orchestra played at the opening mass at Soldier Field, which was attended by 500,000 people. The second day was dedicated to the concerns of children, and a choir of more than 60,000 children from across the Archdiocese sang for that Mass.
The third day was dedicated to the concerns of women in the church. The Mass that day featured a choir of about 10,000 women, both religious and lay. Mass on the final day was held at St. Mary of the Lake Seminary, and more than 1,000,000 faithful crowded into the grounds for the Mass held on the front steps of the brand new Immaculate Conception Chapel.
This
1,000,000 people.
1,000,000.
Oh.
I've seen. There are some pictures online that you can see. It's just a sea of people. It's incredible. I can't even imagine the logistics of getting everybody there, because it wasn't like it was built up. There weren't highways. There was a rail. Insane.
It's amazing.
Yeah. This was the first Eucharistic Congress that welcomed lay faithful to the events, and they turned out, obviously, in massive numbers.
Yes. That Congress was a massive success. People from all over the world attended. Chicago had been considered missionary territory in the church as recently as 1908. Now, in 1926, this event saw church officials, local governments, and heads of civic organizations working well together. It really was a watershed moment for the church in the U.S., and in particular in Northern Illinois.
Just 4 years later, Bishop Joseph Rummel of Omaha would welcome the 6th National Eucharistic Congress to his diocese. This Congress also welcomed Cardinal Mundelein, as well as Bishop Joseph Schrems of Cleveland.
Bishop Schrems was important because he had taken over as the lead bishop for National Eucharistic Congresses in the U.S. during the 1920s. The previous head was Bishop Camillus Maz of Covington, Kentucky, but he had died in 1915. That was probably another reason it took a while to get national congresses going again after World War I ended in 1918.
Bishop Maas had kept the affairs confined to clergy gathering, praying together, and presenting talks to one another. I mean, those gatherings undoubtedly bore fruit for the clergy who attended, and thereby for the faithful who were fed by those shepherds. But Schrems and Rummel made a point of inviting the lay faithful, and they came. In addition to massive crowds at the public masses, 40,000 lay faithful attended Eucharistic adoration at the Creighton University Stadium. The Congress in Omaha also garnered secular news coverage by the Fox Hearst Company out of New York, who brought camera crews to Omaha.
Now, this is 1930, so we're not talking TV, we're talking newsreels.
Newsreels, right, yes. Mm-hmm.
Just to clarify.
Mm-hmm.
In 1935, Bishop Schrems brought the 7th National Eucharistic Congress to his own diocese of Cleveland. 500,000 American Catholics gathered for prayer and to deepen their devotion to Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament. Speakers included the 40-year-old Monsignor Fulton Sheen, who is then a professor at Catholic University. Another speaker was Al Smith, the former governor of New York and the 1928 nominee for president on the Democrat ticket. He was the first Catholic nominated on a major party ticket, but he lost to Herbert Hoover.
The civic reception on the first day welcomed many civic dignitaries, including the mayor of Cleveland, the governor of Ohio, as well as the Postmaster General James Farley, who was there as President Franklin Roosevelt's representative. The final day of this Congress was declared a civic holiday by the mayor of Cleveland, and it featured a procession of 20,000 Catholics to Cleveland Municipal Stadium. Once in the stadium, they welcomed the Blessed Sacrament and listened to an address delivered via radio by Pope Pius XI himself. The closing Mass that day saw 125,000 worshipers there in Cleveland Municipal Stadium, which had a maximum capacity in its day as the Browns and Indian Stadium of about 81,000.
3 years later, 1938, a familiar figure hosted the 8th National Eucharistic Congress in New Orleans. Joseph Rummel, who had hosted the 6th Congress as Bishop of Omaha, had been appointed Archbishop of New Orleans in 1935. He wasted no time working with Bishop Schrems to have the 8th National Eucharistic Congress down in the Big Easy. This event, mercifully held in October when the weather is more bearable down there, featured a procession of 80,000 people. The procession took 5 hours to wind its way along the route. Cardinal Mundelein served as the papal representative. He rode on the carnival-style float that bore the Blessed Sacrament, kneeling and sitting in prayer and adoration for the entire 5-hour procession. Property owners along the route were encouraged to plant yellow and white flowers in honor of the papal colors, and Pope Pius XI once again addressed the crowd via shortwave radio broadcast.
2 other new features of this Congress, a $25,000 floodlight bank, and we're talking, 1930s dollars. Floodlight bank was set up to illuminate the massive stage and baldacchino erected in the stadium for the final Mass, which was held at midnight. And the procession was overseen by the Goodyear blimp Reliance, which participated in broadcasting sermons and prayers from a loudspeaker.
The last National Eucharistic Congress held before, now 2024, was in 1941, and it was held at the Minnesota State Fairgrounds just outside Minneapolis-St. Paul. More than half of the American bishops attended, along again with tens of thousands of Catholics from across the country.
Pope Pius XII addressed the assembly this time, exhorting the faithful to be thankful to God for the freedom they enjoyed to practice their religion in peace. And Pius XII wasn't just saying nice things about our Constitution and Bill of Rights. While he was somewhat safe within Vatican City, Italy was, at the time, run by the fascist dictatorship of Benito Mussolini and was fighting alongside Nazi Germany in World War II. Pius XII was a very brave man, but also a consummate diplomat, and a man of international capacity, if you will. He knew exactly what he was saying, to whom, and past whom he was saying it, so his message was important and valued.
The final day of this Congress was declared a state holiday by the governor of Minnesota. The governor also encouraged all state offices and private businesses to close to accommodate the procession which took place that day. 80,000 people gathered to take part. It was a scorching hot day, 92 muggy degrees, as the crowd began to gather. But just before things were supposed to get going, the skies opened and a downpour soaked the route and the fields at the state fairgrounds where the closing mass was to take place. The faithful were undaunted. Despite lingering light showers here and there, the massive procession made its way to the fairgrounds for adoration and mass. 300 people were treated for heat stroke at the field hospital, set up and staffed in part by Boy Scouts.
And that was the final National Eucharistic Congress held in the United States until this year, 83 years later.
But it wasn't the final Eucharistic Congress in the United States. The 41st International Eucharistic Congress was held in Philadelphia in 1976.
Philadelphia, 1976. 200 years after the Declaration of Independence was adopted in that same city.
Yeah, not much going on.
Yeah, not really. Fortunately for the city's infrastructure, the Eucharistic Congress was in August, so about a month after the major events surrounding the bicentennial celebrations.
But this Congress featured some very important guests. 2 canonized saints, Mother Teresa and Karol Cardinal Wojtyła, then the Archbishop of Krakow. Also there as a speaker was Dorothy Day, co-founder of the Catholic Worker Movement. She's a servant of God, so she's along the path to canonization in her own right. And the final major speaker to note, though he's nowhere on the path to canonization, was President Gerald Ford himself.
Right. I mean, what a sign of acceptance of Catholics in the country and our integration into society that the president attended in person rather than sending a delegate or a representative.
Yeah, really. This Congress also welcomed tens of thousands of people from all around the world. A procession from the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul to the Art Museum included 350,000 people.
One of the major things to come out of this Congress was the well-known Operation Rice Bowl. You know, those little paperboard boxes that are kind of shaped like bowls that Catholic schools pass out for loose change during Lent. Did your school do those? Do you ever go to school that did those?
No.
No, okay. Well, my school passed them out. I went to a Catholic grade school, and that those things started at this Congress. And as of August of 2019, which was the article I found, that fundraiser had brought in over $300 million for the global work of Catholic relief services.
And that's the digest version of the history of Eucharistic Congresses in the United States up to this point. We are thrilled that another is happening this year in Indianapolis. Hopefully it bears much fruit, and hopefully it's not so long before the next one. This has been American Catholic History. If you enjoy American Catholic History, please become a supporter. We've got great perks for supporters. Get information on how to become a supporter and the perks at americanCatholicHistory.org/support.
Also on our website, sign up for our newsletter, learn more about the Eucharistic Congresses in the United States, see about our pilgrimages, and find out about other great stories from American Catholic history.
We also love the great reviews our listeners leave. Those, and especially those 5-star ratings, help others find us. You also can email us feedback, questions, tips for episode topics, or other comments at feedback@americancatholichistory.org. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/AmericanCatholicHistory, on Instagram at ACH_podcast, and follow us on Twitter at ACH1513. I'm Noelle Heaster-Crow.
And I'm Tom Crow.
Thank you once again for joining us on American Catholic History, made possible by listeners like you. He was the first Catholic nominated on a major party ticket, but he lost to Hubert Heaver. What the world? Where did that come from?
Hubert Heaver.
Hubert Heaver.
Oh. Woo.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
I know. I'm like, we have like 2 minutes to finish this.